Day 12. Jake and Bo awakened early the next morning from an uneventful night. Jake got up and slipped his sweatpants on and walked over to the stove to start a fire so he could make a pot of coffee. He got the coffee pot ready and set it on the stove to boil. He walked over and opened the door and stepped outside and walked behind the cabin to take a leak. When he stepped back inside the cabin, Bo was up and sitting at the table. "How'd you sleep last night?" "Great. And you?" "I slept like a log. Last night was the first good night's sleep I've had since Steve and I got here. It was nice since we didn't get interrupted by the creatures." "It sure was." "We're almost out of coffee," Jake said. Bo said, "It's gonna be hard going through caffeine withdrawal." "Yeah, I just don't like the damned headaches that come with it." Bo got up and stretched and walked outside. Jake assumed it was to take a leak like he had done earlier. Jake sat down at the table and lit a cigarette while he waited for the coffee to boil. Bo stepped back inside the cabin just as Jake poured him and Bo a cup. Bo sat down at the table and sipped his coffee. "Whenever you're ready, we'll go fetch the firewood and some more canned food. I'd like to drink another cup of coffee and wake up a little bit first." "Take your time. I'm in no big hurry." Bo got up and walked over to the shelves to see if his clothes and boots were dry. "My clothes are dry, but my boots are still a little damp." "Move him closer to the stove." Jake got up and felt his clothes. They were dry, but his sneakers were still damp, so he moved them closer to the stove. Bo walked over to his cot and put the sweatpants and shirt on he wore yesterday and returned to the table and sat back down. Bo said, "I sure hope the Youngbloods will be home when we get there." "Me too. I'd hate to walk all that way for nothing." "Yeah, me too." "I'm surprised the Bigfoot didn't come calling again last night," Jake said. "They might have finally figured out they can't get into the cabin and be waiting to attack us today. We're gonna have to stay alert." "I agree. It seems like they come and go in spurts. They fooled me and Steve one other time. They didn't come around for a day or two, so we got back into our normal routine, and then wham. That's when the one Bigfoot broke into the house while we were in the kitchen eating dinner. That's not good." Jake got up and changed back into the jeans he wore yesterday. "We can put our dry clothes in a pillowcase to carry to the other side of the river. Once we get to the river, we can take our shoes off and put them in the pillowcase to keep them dry." "That's a good idea. Hopefully, whoever carries them won't slip and fall in like I did yesterday and get everything wet." "I'll carry them," Jake said. "I don't see any reason to have to carry the flashlights today because we know where we're going and we'll be back here well before nightfall if the Youngbloods ain't home." "We'll still need to carry the axes though," Bo said. "Yeah," Jake said, "but we can tuck the handles down the backs of our pants like we did yesterday. That'll free both our hands so we can better hold onto the cable while we cross." "I hope so. I sure don't want to fall in again." Jake got up and poured himself another cup of coffee and sat back down at the table. "I'll be ready to go in a few minutes. We need to empty the buckets so we'll have something to carry the food in from the cellar." Bo got up and emptied the water outside the door and then set the buckets back down. "What did you want to get first, food or firewood?" "I want to get the firewood first because we'll need to make 2 trips." "That makes sense." They both put their shoes on and Jake got up and grabbed both axes and handed one to Bo and said, "Let's go." They stepped out of the cabin and Jake closed the door but didn't lock it. He put the padlock through the hasp and let it dangle. They headed off down the main trail that led to the road. Bo pointed out the differences between the electric and phone lines on their way to the woodpile. They picked up their first load of firewood and headed back to the cabin. While they walked back up the main trail, a wood knock rang out from near Jake's grandparents' house. A few seconds later, another wood knock rang out that sounded like it came from the barnyard, and then a whistle from near the spring. Jake said, "It sounds like we have company." "Maybe we should take a break when we get back to the cabin and wait to see what might happen," Bo said. "Yeah, it's better to be safe than sorry." "I agree." They both set their axes down outside the cabin. Jake opened the door and they stepped inside and deposited their firewood on top of the dwindling pile beneath the window. They each grabbed a chair and stepped back outside and sat down. They sat and waited for about 20 minutes before they heard another would not come from the direction of the barnyard and another whistle from the spring. Bo said, "We should get going and get the next load of firewood since we haven't heard anything more for a little while." "All right," Jake said. "Let's go." Jake closed the door, and again, he didn't lock it. They left their chairs sit outside and picked their axes back up and headed down the trail for the second load of firewood. They walked to the woodpile with caution. They didn't see anything, so they felt it was safe to load up on their second load of firewood and head back to the cabin. They made it all the way back without incident. They stepped inside the cabin and deposited their second loads of firewood onto the growing pile beneath the window. They walked back outside and sat down to rest a few minutes before they would return to the cellar to stock up on food. They rested for about 15 minutes and headed back down the trail. Bo carried both empty buckets and Jake carried both axes. They made their way through the car lot toward the front gate that led into the yard. Jake motioned for Bo to stop when he neared the gate. A 7-foot-tall bronze-colored Bigfoot stood between the house and the cellar. The Bigfoot looked up and saw them. It threw its head back and whooped, and then ran behind the house toward the barnyard. A return whoop echoed from behind the barn. They watched as the Bigfoot leaped over the fence and ran off in that direction. "That was close," Bo said. "Yeah, I'm happy it took off and didn't try to attack us. That's a new one." "That's not one from the barn or pig pen?" "No, I haven't seen that one before. Who knows where it came from?" They made their way through the front gate and approached the cellar. Jake set both axes down outside the cellar door and opened it. Bo looked inside. "This looks like a small grocery store." "Be sure to check the dates on the jar lids and look for any discoloration of the food in the jars," Jake said. "Look at the jars at the back of each row first because Grandma always rotated her stock." "Will do. Take whatever you want to eat." They each took one bucket and walked inside the cellar to stock up on canned goods. They filled their buckets with a variety of foods. Jake made sure to grab some more of his grandma's canned sausage and sausage gravy. Bo grabbed a mixture of vegetables and some more canned vegetable soup. Bo walked back outside with his full bucket and set it down. Jake shouted from inside the cellar, "There should be another 5-gallon bucket on the front porch near the water pump." Bo must have gone and looked for it and evidently found it because within a couple minutes, he walked back inside the cellar and continued to shop. Jake said, "My bucket's full and I'm gonna go back outside and keep watch while you finish up." That sounds like a good idea because that Bigfoot could come back any minute. Bo filled his second bucket and walked back outside to join Jake. Jake closed and locked the cellar door and picked up both axes. They made their way back to the cabin. Bo carried 2 buckets of food while Jake carried 1 bucket of food and both axes. They never did see the Bigfoot again that stood between the house and cellar. Jake put all the jars of food they collected on the shelves near the stove after he went back inside the cabin at some point. "We'll have to fetch some more water." "Now's as good a time as any." Jake said, "Come on, let's go." Jake gathered the buckets and Bo grabbed an axe and they headed off up the trail to the spring. They noticed several different sets of fresh footprints around the spring. Bo stood guard while Jake rinsed the buckets out and filled them with water. They headed back down the trail to the cabin once the buckets were full. Jake carried 2 buckets of water while Bo carried 1 bucket of water and the axe. Jake filled 2 glasses with water and sat them down on the table after they made it back to the cabin. He sat the buckets of water between the stove and the wall of the cabin and placed a dinner plate on the top of each bucket to keep insects and debris out of the water. After he took care of the buckets, he picked up the glasses of water and stepped back outside to join Bo, who already sat in one of the chairs. He handed Bo a glass of water and sat down and lit a cigarette. "Thank you, but you don't have to wait on me. I would have got my own glass of water." "What are friends for?" Jake said. "It's no big deal. I just filled the glasses before I put the water away. That's all. We should leave to visit the Youngbloods after we rest a few minutes." "I agree. It's probably about 11 o'clock or 11:30 a.m., and we need to get there and back before dark. It should only take us about 3 hours round trip. That's if they're not home." They continued to rest for about another half hour, and Bo asked, "Are you ready?" "Yeah. Let me get the pillowcase with our clothes and then close and lock the door." Bo carried the chairs back inside while Jake packed the pillowcase. He put a single towel in the pillowcase along with a change of clothes for each of them. They stepped back outside and Jake closed and locked the door. They picked up their axes and headed down the trail to the bottom of the hillside and toward the river. They made their way down over the riverbank and stopped to take their shoes off. Jake pulled the towel and clothes back out of the pillowcase and put Bo's boots and his shoes in the bottom of it. He put the towel and clothes back inside and wound the top of the pillowcase shut and placed it between his teeth. Jake waded a little way out into the river and grasped the closest steel cable with both hands and waded on across as he pulled himself along the cable. He noticed the river had receded a little bit more since yesterday because the water wasn't quite as deep. Yesterday, the water was just above his waist near his navel, and today, it is level with his waist. He estimated the water level to be just a little over 3 feet deep. It's still too deep to drive through, he thought. Jake made it to the other side of the river and turned around to watch Bo cross. Bo pretty much did the same thing Jake did. He used the cable to pull himself along and made it all the way across this time without incident. They climbed to the top of the riverbank and walked over to Jake's overturned car. They dried off with the towel and then pulled on their dry sweatpants. They spread their wet clothes out on the underside of the car and put their shoes back on. Jake left the wet pillowcase lay on the car beside their wet clothes and the towel. They picked up their axes and walked down the road to the Youngbloods. They walked for a little over an hour before they reached the Youngbloods' cabin. There were no vehicles in the driveway. "Shit," Jake said, his eyebrows lowered, jaw clenched. He heard Bo exclaim a few expletives under his breath. "So much for that," Jake said as he climbed the steps and crossed the porch and looked through the right entryway window. Both lights are still on. "Maybe they spent the night with family or friends somewhere," Bo said. "Maybe. Hopefully, they'll return sometime soon. I hope they do too. I want to find Steve and get out of this hellhole." "That's the plan." Jake stepped back off the porch and joined Bo in the driveway. They turned around and walked back in the direction from which they came. It took them another hour to get back to Jake's car. Jake picked up the towel and their wet clothes and put them, along with Bo's boots and his shoes, back into the pillowcase for their return trip back across the river. They made it back across the river without incident. They made their way up the riverbank and back to the cabin. Jake opened the cabin door and went inside to change out of his wet sweatpants and into a clean pair of jeans. He draped his wet sweatpants over the shelves to dry. Bo stepped into the cabin and stripped out of his wet clothes and said, "I don't have anything dry to change into." Look through Steve's bag to see if he might have packed a few pairs of sweatpants. I doubt his jeans will fit you because he has a smaller waist than you do. Bo looked through Steve's bag but didn't find any sweatpants. He pulled out a pair of jeans and held them up to his waist. It sure looks that way, doesn't it? Steve's jeans looked a couple sizes too small. Bo neatly folded the jeans and put them back inside the bag. He pulled out a pair of Steve's underwear. They look like they'll be snug, but they'll have to do. He slipped the underwear on and pulled them up to his waist. The pair of underwear were definitely snug. It was obvious Steve's underwear were way too tight because the fabric strained to contain Bo's genitals. He reached back into Steve's bag and pulled out a black t-shirt and put it on. He readjusted himself and sat down at the table across from Jake. "I bet it's only 4 p.m. or so," Jake said and asked, "Are you hungry?" "Not really. I will be later. I'd like some more of your grandma's homemade sausage and sausage gravy when we do eat dinner." "I think I can oblige. That stuff's good, ain't it?" "Yeah, probably about the best sausage gravy I've ever had." "Yeah, me too," Jake said. "It's still early. I want to move my chair outside to sit." "I agree," Bo said. "I like to take advantage of sitting outside instead of staying cooped up in this tiny cabin." "We only have a limited amount of time we can sit outside and enjoy it," Jake said. "Even then, we always have to be on the lookout for those damned creatures." Bo said, "It's always about the monsters. I'm sick and tired of them. I'm tired of having to live according to their schedule." "We should put a calendar outside and let them book their own appointments," Jake said. Bo laughed. They carried their chairs outside and sat back down. They sat and faced the bottom and the retreat. Bo pointed to the opening in the tree line that led to the fishing hole. A large reddish-brown Bigfoot burst out of the tree line and into the bottom. It walked toward the retreat. Jake said, "There's another new one. I haven't seen it before. Have you?" "Nope. I've never seen that one either." They watched as the Bigfoot rounded the back corner of the retreat and disappeared between the house and toolshed. They waited for it to reappear on either side of the toolshed, but it never did. They assumed it must have went inside the house for some reason. Jake said, "I wonder what it's doing inside the house. There really ain't any more food in there. The only food I saw was rice and dried beans scattered all over the countertops and floor. I didn't even notice any canned food when I was in there last. Who knows? It seems these creatures are opportunistic. Maybe it's looking for something to make a nest or for something it can use as a tool. Remember how the Bigfoot we saw the other day carried off the saucepan and destroyed it down at the river? Remember how it threw it completely back over the treetops and out into the bottom? Yeah, I remember. It looked like a flying saucer. Bo said, maybe the Bigfoot's looking for something similar that it can use to fetch and carry water or something like that. They continued to look toward the retreat and expected to see the Bigfoot any minute. About 20 minutes went by before the Bigfoot reappeared. It walked past the tool shed back in the direction from which it came as it carried a green bedspread in one arm and a huge armful of furniture stuffing in the other. Bo beat Jake to the punch and said, that sucker's gonna make himself a nest. It sure looks that way, don't it? Jake said. They watched as the Bigfoot walked back toward the fishing hole and disappeared over the riverbank. They heard branches and twigs snap as it walked to the left toward the direction of where they discovered the gravesite 2 days earlier. Jake said, we should go back to the retreat to see if there's anything else in there we can use. Like what? We can get a few more blankets and look through the remaining clothes and find you some clothes that fit. That kind of thing. I guess it wouldn't hurt. They stepped back into the cabin and put on a pair of their dry, dirty socks and their shoes before they headed out. Jake said, boy, you look funny wearing your boots and only a pair of underwear and a t-shirt. I'm not modest, and I'm also not out to impress anybody, Bo said and smiled. Jake snickered and said, you might impress a female Bigfoot if she gets a good look at you. Bo laughed and said, I sure hope not. I don't need me no big bad hairy Bigfoot mama trying to hook up with me now. Jake laughed and laughed so hard he cried. When he stopped laughing, he said, thanks man, I needed that. Come on, let's get going. He closed the cabin door but didn't lock it. He picked up his axe and they made their way to the retreat. They stopped just outside the back door to listen to make sure no other creatures were inside. They walked into the house and Bo's eyes widened, his brows raised. Will you look at this mess and all this destruction? Jake led Bo down the hallway to the master bedroom. I want to get the quilt I suspect my grandmother made from the bed to take back to the cabin. Bo looked through the piles of clothes on the floor in front of the dresser for anything he could wear. He found a pair of jeans and another pair of gray sweatpants. He also found a couple of t-shirts that would fit him. Jake left Bo in the master bedroom while he went into the other bedroom and looked for a couple of blankets. He found 2 on a shelf in the closet. He also picked up a few bath towels and washcloths that were on the shelf next to the blankets. The blankets, towels, and washcloths had never been used. Bo met Jake back in the kitchen and asked, are you done? Yeah, I guess so. They stepped back outside to head back to the cabin. Just when they stepped off the back porch, the reddish-brown Bigfoot they saw earlier walked around the corner of the house. It stopped when it noticed them and growled menacingly. Bo whispered, don't run. Don't turn your back and back up around the opposite corner of the house. They walked backwards and slowly made their way around the opposite corner of the house away from the Bigfoot while they kept their eyes on it the entire time. It didn't advance. When Jake and Bo made it around the corner of the house and out of view of the Bigfoot, Bo yelled, run. They ran around to the front of the house. The Bigfoot ran around the other way into the front yard and cut off their escape. They both stopped while it stood before them and growled and gnashed its teeth. This time, it advanced. It took one giant step toward them. Jake threw down the blankets and other stuff he carried and raised his axe high above his head and ran directly toward the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot advanced yet again. It took another huge step toward Jake. Jake was within 4 feet of the massive beast when he swung his axe and struck it in the center of its huge chest. The Bigfoot shrieked and hit Jake upside his head with its huge left hand and then shoved him to the ground. It backed away while it tried to dislodge the axe. It shrieked yet again and stumbled backward and fell down onto its back. It continued to wail and shriek, but dropped what he carried and ran to where Jake lay on the ground. Jake was unconscious. Bo noticed blood that gushed from the right side of Jake's forehead. Bo looked toward the Bigfoot and noticed large amounts of blood as it came from its nose and mouth. It had dislodged the axe from its chest and blood spurted from the gaping hole the axe had left. Bo thought to himself, good. Jake severed a major artery and the Bigfoot will bleed to death. It lay there and withered in agony before it took its final breath a few seconds later. The Bigfoot now lay silent. Bo knew he had little time before one or more creatures came to the dead Bigfoot's aid. He turned his attention back to Jake and kneeled down beside him to assess the damage to the right side of his forehead. There was a 2-inch tear on his right temple that was made by one or more of the Bigfoot's long fingernails when it had struck him. Bo hurriedly got back up and retrieved a washcloth and towel from the things that Jake carried. He walked back over to Jake and kneeled back down beside him. He wiped the blood from his forehead. He shook Jake a few times on his left shoulder to wake him. Jake slowly opened his eyes and jumped to his feet to continue to fight the Bigfoot. He saw the dead Bigfoot as it lay a couple yards away and fell back to the ground. He sat there for a few minutes to catch his breath. His fall knocked the wind out of him. Bo continued to kneel beside Jake and said, "You killed the Bigfoot with the axe," as a scream emanated from the lower end of the bottom. Bo held the washcloth up to Jake's right temple and applied pressure to stop the blood flow. Jake placed his hand on the washcloth and held it in place. Bo said, "We need to hurry. Another Bigfoot will be along any minute to check on the dead one." Bo stood back up and walked over next to the dead Bigfoot to retrieve the axe and then returned to Jake's side. He helped Jake get to his feet and then helped him over to where all their stuff lay on the ground. Bo quickly spread open one of the blankets and placed the quilt, other blanket, towels, washcloths, and the clothes he had found into the middle of it. He tied the opposite ends of the blanket together to form a makeshift bag. He slung the bag over his left shoulder and picked up the axe. Bo wrapped his right arm around Jake's shoulders and quickly helped him walk back across the bottom and back up the hillside to the cabin. They made it back without further incident. Bo dropped the bloody axe on the ground outside the door before he helped Jake inside. He threw the rest of the stuff he carried on Jake's cot and then helped Jake sit down at the table after he brought a chair back in from outside. Bo filled a saucepan with water from one of the buckets and took the washcloth from Jake and wet it. He handed the washcloth back to Jake so he could clean up his wound. It took a little while for the blood flow to stop. Jake pulled the washcloth away from his temple and Bo said, "The area around your wound is beginning to bruise and swell." "My head's throbbing and I want to lay down for a little while," Jake said. Bo moved the makeshift bag from off the top of Jake's cot and helped him over to it to lay down. Once Jake laid down, he asked, "Can you please help me get my shoes off? My temple throbs harder when I try to bend over." Bo helped him get his shoes off and then covered him with his blanket. Bo rinsed out and re-wet the washcloth and handed it back to Jake so he could place it back on his temple while he lay there and rested. Jake drifted off to sleep, so Bo went back outside and sat down on the other chair. He thought to himself, "Jake and me are both lucky to have escaped with our lives. That Bigfoot could have easily torn us to shreds. Jake was extremely lucky because his injuries could have been a lot worse. At least when Jake attacked the Bigfoot, he struck it with the axe where it did the most immediate damage. He either struck its heart itself or hit a major artery. At any rate, he killed another one. That's one less monster that we'll have to deal with in the future. That makes 8 that we've killed over the past few days." As Bo sat and looked down toward the retreat, in the bottom he noticed the large Bigfoot that had carried off the one Jake had killed. The other day walked through the bottom toward the direction of the one Jake had just killed. Another larger Bigfoot walked several paces behind the first one. The larger Bigfoot's hair color was a dark chocolate brown. As the sun glistened on its hair, Bo could make out different shades of brown and orange that gave the Bigfoot somewhat of a brindle appearance. Bo watched as both creatures approached the dead one. The smaller of the two creatures bent over the dead one and used its hands to try to rouse it. The smaller Bigfoot kept poking the dead one about its shoulders. At one point, it lifted the dead Bigfoot's left arm and let it drop. Then the smaller Bigfoot placed its face close to the dead one's torso and sniffed it. The smaller Bigfoot stood back up to its full height and threw its head back and howled. The larger one joined the smaller one and howled as well. When their howls faded, they both looked around while they sniffed the air. Both creatures turned and looked in Bo's direction, simultaneously. The larger of the two creatures must have spotted him because it roared at him. The other Bigfoot spotted him as well and growled. Bo continued to watch as both creatures turned back around to face the dead Bigfoot. The smaller one helped the larger one heave the dead one over its left shoulder, and then they made their way back in the direction they came from. After about an hour and a half had gone by, Jake stood in the doorway as he held the washcloth over his right temple. "Can you bring the other chair back outside for me so I can sit outside?" "Sure." Bo stepped back into the cabin and got the chair and brought it back outside for Jake. Jake sat down next to Bo and Bo asked, "How do you feel?" "Like shit." Bo said, "Hold the washcloth away from your temple so I can look at your injury." The gash on your temple has finally stopped bleeding, but the swelling and bruising is getting worse. The bruise is spreading across your forehead and down the right side of your face and looks like a giant handprint. "That's what it felt like when the Bigfoot hit me, like an open-handed slap," Jake said. "I'm lucky it didn't break my neck when it hit me." "Yeah, you are. I think the gash in your temple was caused by its fingernails." "I wouldn't doubt it," Jake said as he put the washcloth back up to his temple. "I wish I had some ice." "I can take one of the buckets to the spring to get some cold water," Bo said as he stood up. "That's the closest thing you're gonna get to ice. I'll just make do with what I've got. It won't be any trouble for me to go and get you some cold water." "Don't worry about it," Jake snapped, his eyebrows lowered, his fists clenched. "I'll be all right." Bo sat back down and they sat in silence for the next few minutes. Bo broke the silence and told Jake how the two creatures came from the direction of the Bigfoot gravesite and retrieved the dead Bigfoot's body. He mentioned how the creatures sniffed the air and saw him as he sat there and how they roared and growled at him. "I'm sorry I snapped at you," Jake said. "I'm not mad at you for offering to get me some cold water. God knows that you've done more than enough for me already. I'm mad at the situation and I'm mad at myself. I'm sick and tired of these damn creatures. It seems we can't do anything without getting tormented by them. We have to stay on alert the entire time we're outside. We have to lock ourselves up and hide in the cabin. We'll probably get paid another visit by them later after it gets dark." "It's no problem, man. Don't sweat it," Bo said. "I'm sure they'll show up here sooner or later. I know where you're coming from. I'm sick and tired of them too. Do you think the creatures will bury this Bigfoot in the same area as the other one since they went that way?" "Who knows? I doubt it. With me killing this one, that makes what? A total of 8. Yeah, that's 8 less of these motherfuckers we have to deal with." "Since none of the rest of the dead creatures are buried near the one we saw the other day, they'll probably bury this one in a different location like the rest," Jake said. "That makes sense. Would you like a glass of water?" "That'd be great," Jake said as he glanced at Bo with tears in his eyes. "And I'm sorry again for snapping at you." "Like I told you, don't worry about it," Bo said as he put his hand on Jake's shoulder and looked him straight in the eyes. "I knew you weren't mad at me." Bo got up and went back in the cabin and returned with 2 glasses of water and handed one to Jake. He watched as Jake poured about a quarter of his glass of water onto the folded washcloth and put the washcloth back up to his swollen temple. Bo said, "I sure hope the gash on your temple doesn't get infected." "I doubt it will. You quickly reacted and stopped the bleeding, and I've been keeping the area rinsed with water. Hopefully that'll work." Jake noticed the sun as it rode low in the western sky and said, "It'll be getting dark soon." "Yeah, it won't be long until we have to head back inside the cabin for the night." They heard a branch snap that sounded like it came from behind the cabin near the tree where Bo hung the severed Bigfoot arm. Jake sat, his glass down, and stood up and picked up the axe that sat near the door and quietly walked around to the side of the cabin to see what made the noise. As he edged closer to the back of the cabin, a large yellow lab ran up to him and almost knocked him down because it ran straight into his legs. Jake asked, "Where'd you come from?" The dog panted and looked at Jake and wagged its tail. Jake kneeled down next to the dog and laid the axe down. The dog kissed his face and nearly knocked him over again. Bo shouted, "What's going on? Who are you talking to?" Jake didn't say anything. He grabbed the axe, stood back up, and walked back toward the front of the cabin to rejoin Bo. The dog followed and ran past him and nearly knocked Bo to the ground because Bo was making his way around the side of the cabin toward Jake. Bo looked at the dog and then at Jake and asked, "Where'd he come from?" Jake said, "Your guess is as good as mine. He was standing underneath the tree where you hung the arm. He was sniffing the air around the arm." They walked back to their chairs and sat down. The dog made his way in between Jake's and Bo's chairs and sat down beside them and continued to pant. They both reached out to pet him. Jake said, "He sure is friendly." "The dog's a she." Jake laughed and said, "I didn't get a chance to determine her gender because she nearly knocked me down twice and then ran around the cabin to greet you." Bo mentioned the obvious, she's not wearing a collar. As healthy as she is, and because she seems well fed, she must belong to somebody. I wonder what her name is. Jake shrugged his shoulders and thought for a moment and said, how about we call her Jeannie? What? Jeannie from My Dream of Jeannie? No, that's too corny. Think about it. It's the perfect name for her. It's a great way to pay homage to your dead buddy Gene. Bo's eyes lit up and a smile appeared on his face. Jeannie it is then. Jake looked at Jeannie. Are you thirsty? Jeannie barked once and wagged her tail. Jake got up and stepped back inside the cabin to get her some water. He emptied the saucepan he had used to re-wet his washcloth. He refilled it with clean water and brought it back outside and set it on the ground near the door. Jeannie walked over to check it out and drank every drop of water in it. That dog's thirsty, Bo said. You're not kidding, Jake said as he stood back up and went back inside the cabin and refilled the pan. He brought it back out and sat it back down. Jeannie continued to drink. As he sat back down, he said, if she keeps drinking like this, I'm gonna have to bring an entire bucket of water out here for her. Bo laughed. Jeannie must have gotten her fill because she walked back over and laid down between Jake and Bo a few minutes later. I wonder how good of a watchdog she is? Bo asked. I don't know, but I hope she'll alert us when the creatures come around. She more than likely will. I'm sure she's more than aware of them. No doubt. Being there's no one else around here for miles, do you suppose she belongs to the Youngbloods? Why would they go off and leave their dog outside without food and water and to wander around when they're gone? Bo asked. Who knows? Stupid people do some pretty stupid things. I agree, Bo said. Stupid is as stupid does. Maybe Jeannie will follow us when we go see if the Youngbloods have returned tomorrow, Jake said. Maybe if she doesn't belong to them, maybe they'll know who she belongs to. Jeannie jumped to her feet and turned to face the hillside behind them. She walked a few steps toward the main trail and acted nervous. She listened and focused her attention on an area about 150 yards farther up the hillside to her right. She paced back and forth while she looked in that direction and then looked back toward Jake and Bo. A loud whoop rang out and Jeannie took off and ran inside the cabin. Jake said, it sounds like we're gonna have to head inside. The natives are getting restless. I agree. Another beautiful night holed up in the cabin, Bo sighed. They picked up their chairs and headed back inside the cabin. Jeannie lay on the foot of Bo's army cot and watched them while she wagged her tail. Jake said, because of all the water she drank, we need to get her to go back outside and pee before we close and brace the door for the night. Bo tried to coax her out the door, but she didn't want any part of that and wouldn't get down from his cot. She's smart, Bo said. She knows there's a monster out there, and she's not gonna go back out there so it can get her. Her mama didn't raise no fool. Bo laughed. Bo lit both lanterns and retrieved Jeannie's water bowl from outside before he closed and braced the door. Jake walked over to Jeannie to pet her and scratch her behind her ears. You'd better not do your business in the cabin tonight. Jeannie licked his hand. Jake said, I need to get dinner started. Bo sat down on Jake's cot to keep Jeannie company while Jake walked over to the stove to get a fire started. Do you still want sausage and sausage gravy? Hell yeah. I've been looking forward to that all day. So have I. Jake got 2 jars of sausage, 1 jar of sausage gravy, and 1 jar of diced potatoes from the shelves. He opened all 4 jars and put the sausage in the frying pan and mixed the potatoes and gravy together in a medium-sized saucepan. He placed the pans on the stove to heat the food. He sat down at the table and watched Jeannie as she interacted with Bo. She lay on her back on the cot while Bo scratched her belly. Jeannie seems like she's starved for affection. I agree, Jake nodded. I doubt she belongs to the Youngbloods because she wouldn't be this starved for attention if she did. I don't know, Jake said, his brow raised, shaking his head. We'll have to wait and see. How's your head feel? Better. The pain's going away, but there's just enough there to nag me a little. What I wouldn't do for a couple aspirin. The swelling looks like it's gone down some, but the bruise is still there. Jake got up and stirred the food. He pulled the pans to the middle of the stove away from the direct heat. He pulled 2 plates and 2 forks from off the top of the warming bin and set them on the table. He filled both his and Bo's water glasses and set them on each side of the table near their plates. dinner will be ready in a couple minutes." He walked to the shelves to get another plate to put some food on for Jeannie. "The food should be warm enough, so help yourself." Bo stood up and walked over to the table to get his plate, and then to the stove, and filled his plate with food from both pans. He sat down at the table. Jake filled his plate and set it on the table across from Bo, and then filled Jeannie's plate and set it aside to cool. Jake sat down at the table and waited to see if Bo wanted to say grace. He assumed he didn't because he had already started to eat. Jake joined him and took a few bites from his plate. Jeannie continued to lay on Bo's cot while Jake and Bo ate. She would look at Jake and then to the plate he set aside. Jake figured she knew the other plate was for her. "You'll get your turn." She barked once. She laid back down on the cot until Jake and Bo finished eating. Jake got up and checked to make sure the food he was going to give her wasn't too hot. It wasn't, so he set her plate on the floor next to her water bowl. She jumped off the cot and ran over to it. She ate her food quickly and looked up at Jake to see if he was going to give her seconds. "You've had enough. Now go lay down." She took a few slurps of water and then jumped back upon Jake's cot and laid back down and went asleep. Jake and Bo continued to sit at the table and talk. "We won't be able to take Jeannie with us when we go to the Youngbloods tomorrow," Bo said. "Why?" "There won't be any way for her to get across the river. Neither you or me can carry her and hold on to the cables at the same time." "I didn't think about that," Jake said. "We're gonna have to leave her here then. We can leave her outside and let her follow us until we cross the river. I don't want to leave her cooped up by herself in this dark cabin while we're gone." "Yeah, I agree with you. But what if she runs away? Maybe she'll wait for us. Hopefully. I'm really starting to like that dog." They sat at the table and continued their conversation. "My grandfather had 2 different dogs that went missing about 4 or 5 years before he died," Jake said. "What happened to them?" "Hold on till I light a cigarette and I'll tell you about them." Jake lit a cigarette and took a couple drags before he began to tell Bo what his grandfather had told him. The first dog that went missing was a black and tan wire-haired Portuguese Podingo mix, and his name was Smokey Joe. Jake said as he exhaled 2 lungs full of smoke. Grandpa had him for about 7 years before he just up and went missing one day. Grandpa searched all around for him, but it seemed like Smokey vanished. He told me that it was unlike him to up and run away. He said the dog never strayed far from the house. Smokey never did turn up. "That's odd," Bo said, his brow furrowed, leaning forward. The dog Grandpa got to replace Smokey was a Norwegian elkhound and his name was Sport. His fur was salt and pepper-colored with a dash of light tan thrown into the mix. He was a beautiful dog. Grandpa got him as a tiny puppy and carried him home in an old feed sack he had slung over his shoulder. My parents and I were visiting when he first got him, and I was angry because he kept him in the cow stable in the barn instead of in the yard at the house. Grandpa told me he had to keep Sport in the barn because he didn't want him to get through the fence and fall into the river and drown. He told me Sport would have to grow up a little bit before he could keep him in the yard. Sport was smart. To get out of the yard, he would walk up one of the diagonal fence post corner supports in the backyard and jump over the fence and out into the road. Grandpa said when Sport would get out of the yard occasionally, he would sometimes roam for a day or 2 before he came back home to get some of Grandma's good home cooking. He also said Sport really never left the yard that much because he was too afraid he'd miss a good meal. Bo snickered. "I'd be afraid of missing out on a good meal too. Your grandma was a good cook." "You're not kidding. Too bad you couldn't taste her food when she was alive." Anyway, Grandpa told me that one day, Sport took off and never came back just like Smokey Joe did. Just like Smokey Joe. He came up missing when he was about 5 years old. Grandpa said Sport always wore a wide leather collar. He said about a year after Sport disappeared, the neighbor on top of the mountain, the one whose farm you bought, was deer hunting and found his old leather collar torn completely in 2 laying at the bottom of an old oak tree. Grandpa said the neighbor brought the collar to him to show him how something tore it in 2. He said he suspected Sport got tangled up with a bear and the bear killed him. However, the neighbor said he didn't find Sport's remains next to the torn collar. They were nowhere to be found. I've often wondered if both Smokey Joe and Sport fell victim to a Bigfoot. It's highly unlikely a bear tore Sport's collar in half. Based on what you've said, it does sound that way. According to what Grandpa said, both dogs were young, healthy, and in the prime of their lives. It wouldn't be like them to take off and never return. In addition, Sport was big enough he could take down any black bear. Norwegian elk hounds are specifically bred to take down big game like bear and moose. Bo said, "I suspect a Bigfoot probably did get a hold of them. In my research on the subject, investigators say that a Bigfoot will often kill a dog if the dog's harassing one. I suspect you're right." Jeannie jumped down from Jake's cot and walked toward the back wall of the cabin near where Bo fixed the hole in the chinking. She cocked her head and listened to something outside. She moved toward the window and did the same thing, except when she reached the window, she growled down deep in her throat. "Given the way she's acting, I suspect there's one or more creatures outside," Jake said. "I bet you're right." They stopped talking and continued to watch Jeannie and listen for any sign of the creatures. Jeannie paced back and forth. She would first pace to the back wall of the cabin and then to the window. She let loose with several more deeper growls at each location at one point. "She's alerting and telling us there's 2 creatures outside," Jake said. "It sure looks that way." Suddenly, a creature struck the front wall of the cabin next to where Jake and Bo sat at the table. Jeannie jumped suddenly, as did Bo and Jake. Jeannie ran underneath the table between them and barked ferociously toward the front wall. The Bigfoot hit the wall again and roared, mercilessly. Jeannie ran to Jake's cot with her tail between her legs and climbed underneath it and laid down while she shuddered and whimpered. Jake and Bo got up from the table and moved away from the wall. They both sat on Bo's cot. They tried to call Jeannie out from underneath Jake's cot. She wouldn't budge. Bo tried to drag her out from underneath the cot, and she gently nipped and bit at him. "It's obvious she doesn't want any part of the creatures," Jake said. Who could blame her? If it wasn't for the damned creatures, we wouldn't be stuck here. "I surely hope the Youngbloods will be back home tomorrow so we can find Steve and get the hell out of here," Jake said. "I agree. The sooner the better." The Bigfoot that struck the cabin wall near the table sounded like it was pacing back and forth outside. At one point, it sounded like it moved in the direction of the window on the side wall. Either it or another Bigfoot struck the shutter. A different Bigfoot struck the door at the same time. Jeannie scrambled out from underneath the cot and ran to the door and barked more ferociously now than ever. It sounded like the Bigfoot at the door retreated. Jake and Bo could hear branches and twigs snap as it backed up into the brush that stood about 10 feet away from the door. Jeannie ran to the window and barked again. The Bigfoot at the window also sounded like it retreated because they heard it walk away through the brush. Jeannie came back over and sat down on the floor in front of Jake and Bo. They pet her. "Hopefully the creatures won't be back tonight," Bo said. "Hopefully not." Jake got up and walked over to the stove and refilled Jeannie's plate with everything that was left over from dinner and sat it back down beside her water bowl. As he refilled Jeannie's plate, he said, "I'm gonna reward you for doing such a good job by scaring the creatures away." Jeannie walked back over to her plate and looked at it, and then looked at Jake and wagged her tail and barked. She barked as if to say, "Thank you." In a gentle voice, Jake said, "No, thank you, Jeannie." She began to eat, and he told her, "You're welcome." Jake figured it was at least 9 p.m. or a little after, and he was tired and ready for bed. "It's been a rough day, and I'm gonna turn in." "I heard. I'm tired, and I'm gonna turn in too," Bo said. Jake put the lantern out that sat on the shelves while Bo got up and dimmed the lantern that sat on the table. Once Jeannie finished her second meal, she made her way in between the 2 cots and laid down and took a deep, contented breath. Jake took his shoes and pants off and laid them on the floor underneath the head of his cot. He crawled into his cot while he faced Bo and Jeannie and covered up with his blanket. Bo stripped everything off and crawled into his cot and covered up with his blanket. Jake reached to the floor between the cots and pet Jeannie until he fell asleep. Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.